Welcome back everyone to another Health and Wellbeing Society talk. Today I'm going to be talking about ultra-processed food. This is a massive category. It is really important that a lot of us understand and are aware of, even though we can't always make those changes. So, to start off with, I'm going to be talking right from the beginning, back 3.5 billion years ago, when life began on our planet. At this time, very, very small creatures and life began forming. They evolved because they were able to use basic resources like iron or hydrogen, carbon, oxygen. They were able to use these basic resources, and with these resources, they were able to generate themselves to perpetually stay alive, which is what we today consider life. These organisms grew and multiplied, there became more of them, and eventually they took up so much space that instead of an organism feeding off these dead materials and compounds, an organism would make another organism do the hard work and then eat that, getting everything it needed from that other object. This is where life evolved from the first phase of eating unalive compounds, just inert matter, and began eating other life forms such that it could multiply and grow faster. Instead of having to compete for the same resources, it could completely skip ahead of the queue and just eat another organism for those resources. That's how our food initially evolved. Then, a few 100 million years later, or billion, there are humans existing. And we as humans, we did the same. We would eat a beetle or a raccoon, and we would eat that animal to get those resources. The resources that animal had acquired already for us. Except there was a change where humans began to learn to process food. We had gone from being a species that would only eat either those inert initial compounds, or we ate those newer compounds from the animals that had produced them for us. And we came to process food. An example of not processing would be taking an apple from a tree or hunking and eating that straight off away. An example of processing could be anything that changes the substance of your food. So hunking a piece of meat off a cow, cooking under fire, even selectively modifying and breeding plants, that too will change that composition, and that is considered processing. And we are some of the few species, in fact, we are likely the only species that actually processes their food, being processivores. And this processing allows us to go a lot further, and it's genetically in our systems to do this. We have enzymes to break down those specific compounds that could only come about through processing. And so it's really essential to our health. And to go further, if you take meat, or say beef, if you were to grind and cook that beef, there is 25% more energy available to us. So it is very much an evolutionary benefit for us to have that energy from the foods. This was all good, and we did it for hundreds of years. We become well adapted to it. It evolved into our culture, into our people, into the way we lived our life, was to not just eat food, but to process it, such that we could maximize the benefits we got from our food. And it was then in around 1869 that the landscape of food has forever changed and impacted people's health more than it ever will ever again, I hope. In 1869, Napoleon III, the nephew of the famous Napoleon who lost in Waterloo, Napoleon III set out a challenge. He offered a prize to anyone who could produce a butter-like substance. And the reason he did this was because butter in and of itself is very expensive. You first of all have to get an animal, a baby, you have to then raise it, you have to milk it, you then have to process the butter, and then it doesn't even store very long. So after an enormous process to get this butter, and it doesn't store very long, it becomes very expensive. Napoleon, a military man, wanted a cheaper way of getting the fuel for his people. And eventually a scientist did accomplish it. And I'll read off his recipe because it's quite convoluted and frankly disgusting. A French chemist who is now considered to have developed the first ultra-processed food. He took cheap, solid fat from a cow called suet. He rendered it, digested it with some enzymes from a sheep's stomach to break down the cellular tissue holding the fat together. He pushed it through a sieve, allowed it to set, extruded from between two plates, bleached with acid, washed with water, warmed, and finally mixed with bicarb, milk protein, cow udder tissue, and anatomy. The result was a spreadable, plausible butter substitute. Now you may have noticed in saying that I started off with and later used two substances from an animal, from a cow. Nonetheless, as well, there was a sheep's stomach. So these processes are still relying on other animals. But the concept of producing the same result through a different path was what was key to the revolution of ultra-processed food, and that's why this started it. Later on, in the early 20th century, scientists did discover how to make butter without using any animal fat whatsoever, and they made it out of oils. The way you can do this is if you take any oil and you react it with hydrogen at high pressures, you will hydrogenize the oil. And this hydrogenation process gives you full control over its texture. If you fully hydrogenate it, it'll be rock solid hard. And if you partially hydrogenate it from any range in its spectrum, you can get it to the perfect consistency. You have full control over something's palate and how it tastes. And this is where the ultra-processed food market boomed. The reason it's so key is because ultra-processed food is taking something that would normally be expensive and making it cheap. And through that process, they can completely overhaul any other business selling whole foods. And this potentially had some health consequences. So in 2010, a Brazilian researcher called Carlos Monteiro looked into the ultra-processed category. In fact, in 2010, only 15 years ago, he invented the category. He took foods into 4 different categories called de novo classification. I won't go into too much detail because it's not particularly relevant, but the first is called unprocessed or minimally processed ingredients. These could be anything from a whole apple, a steak, an uncooked steak, unprocessed steak, but it also extends to things like flour and pasta. So they're minimally or unprocessed foods. You then have processed culinary ingredients, and these are things like salt and sugar and honey, anything that's useful for your fundamentals of your cooking but doesn't matter much. Third, we have the processed foods. These are ingredients that have been processed somewhat. So it could be a tin of beans, you don't naturally find that, it's somewhat processed, it's not fundamental to cooking. You could have salted peanuts or cured meat. They have been processed. The details of those categories don't matter. What is important is this 4th category. Carlos defined it as the ultra-processed food category, and this category is what has been shown since to have a profound impact on our health. And it is for a variety of complicated reasons, but objectively, he has shown that this category of food impacts our health negatively. It has one of the longest scientific definitions. I'm not going to try and recite it to you nor memorize it. But he says ultra-processed food is formulations of ingredients, mostly of exclusive industrial use, made by a series of industrial processes, many requiring sophisticated equipment and technology, such as the butter example. Processes and ingredients used to manufacture ultra-processed food are designed to create highly profitable, low-cost, high shelf life, emphatic branding, convenient, ready to consume, hyper-palatable products, liable to display freshly prepared meals and dishes. That's the definition he gave for ultra-processed food. It pertains no description of what the food will consist of, why it was made, etc. It just says it is used to make a lot of profit at low cost and manipulate people. This has been pursued. There is an enormous range of products now that we can assume under that hood of being ultra-processed food. And so even though in 2010 that definition was created, it only really got traction in 2017, when a very bright nutrition scientist called Kevin Hall was sitting at a conference table. Next to him was the Pepsi executive, and he said to him, "There's some new research coming out about this ultra-processed food, and I'm wondering what you think of it." And this was unbeknownst to Hall, he had never heard it before. And he said, "What is it? What's it about?" The executive gave him the definition, and he scoffed and said, "That can't be anything right." He had spent years, decades, studying nutrition science, how those fundamental compounds constitute our nutritional deficiencies. What we need comes from these individual parts. So to him, a definition about broadly defining cheap products, not defining any chemicals or compounds, it was irrelevant, it was laughable, a joke. Nonetheless, as a good scientist, he put it to the test. He put to disprove ultra-processed food. He had a lot of funding, so he was able to take groups of people where he put them into a room and he said, you are either going to be consuming, well, actually he didn't tell them, but they were either going to consume 80% ultra-processed food, 20% normal food, or 80% prepared meals, really nice meals, done by a chef, and 20% ultra-processed food. So he was flipping their diets to compare the impact of ultra-processed food. And he controlled for the salt intake, the sugar, the calories. He controlled for all that. He made sure the meals looked equally appetizing. He made sure everything was so perfectly controlled, even to the extent where even people would wear baggy clothes so they couldn't tell if their weight was changing. And after 2 weeks of 24/7 on one diet, they'd switch and go to the other diet. And when the results came in, Hall was astounded because he had proven himself wrong. The participants had all gained or began eating 500 more calories a day, even though they were both allowed to eat as a buffet. Both groups, when they went on the ultra-processed diet, they'd eat 500 more calories a day and gain weight with accordance to that increasing calorie consumption. They were allowed to eat as much food as they wanted. In fact, all of them would end up being stuck. They wouldn't eat all the food available to them. But they still had that impact on their bodies. Since then, in only the last 8 years, there have been hundreds of studies and many, many meta-analyses, and they have shown that ultra-processed food is linked to several health consequences. Ultra-processed food is associated with, at the least, death, cardiovascular disease, cancers, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, fatty liver disease, inflammatory bowel syndrome, depression, worse blood fat profile, fertility, irritable bowel syndrome, and dementia. 10% increased consumption of ultra-processed food is related to a 25% increased risk of dementia, 14% increased risk of Alzheimer's. These studies are well controlled for. They are looking at whether it is just foods that fit into this category. They're looking at whether that is correlated to these health consequences, and it religiously is shown to be. I don't tell you this because I want you to be demoralised or feel that you're unable to do anything, because it is a hard system. This food is designed to be cheap, it's designed to be really desirable, and it's marketed to you really well, just so you want it, and you're forced into a position where you eat it. It is shown to increase your addiction. You desire it, it's a comfort food. It's all around us. It's so hard to fight against, but it's shown thoroughly that it causes these health consequences. To touch on the mechanisms, there are a variety of hypothesized mechanisms, but as I said initially, that category of food, it's just defined as what fits into this category. It's a bit like creating a bucket of colours of people's t-shirts. It doesn't necessarily have any mechanisms, but it just says if it's in this category, it's correlated with health consequences. And you may think, oh, does it matter if it's just one ingredient that's putting it in this category? Yes. Because the mechanisms aren't yet known, anything that fits into that category counts. So what does fit into that category? The general way of looking at it, the general way of determining if substance is ultra-processed food, is if it is even more than one ingredient that you generally wouldn't find in someone's kitchen at home, it is ultra-processed food. You could have a whole Alpine bar, which all seems fine, but if it has milk, whey protein, which it does, it's ultra-processed food. There are some substances like flour which contain added compounds like calcium oxide that are important, but nonetheless they are considered ultra-processed food. Another definition is that if a product, a package, contains a health label, added vitamin C, added fibre, that makes it ultra-processed food. It's trying to market itself to you, and that does make it ultra-processed food. In and of itself, it may be fine, but all I can tell you, all that can be said, is that at the moment, that is highly correlated with health consequences. So whether you think you should have it or not is completely up to you. I will certainly have an oven pizza every now and then. I love Lindor, I have them all the time. But it's the health consequences are always going to be true. So it becomes important to think about what we can do. It's not an easy one, because it's made so cheap and it's so hard to get away from. But we do need to work on how we can get away from it ourselves. And the first one, I've already given it all to you, is self-awareness. Non-judgmental self-awareness of just noticing when you're eating and consuming these different foods. Being aware, you don't need to criticise or tell yourself off from it, just look at a packet and go, oh, this is ultra-processed food. If it helps, look at the packet label after you've eaten it. You're just there to become aware of it, such that in the future, when you've got more agency or control, for example, in a financial position, you can make a change. So first of all, just become non-judgmentally aware. After that, you can start changing and you can try to reduce. You can go, ooh, this glass one does have a load of unnecessary ingredients. It's that ultra-processed food category. I'm going to try and avoid it today and maybe make my own later. You are trying to move away from that process of consuming ultra-processed food. From there, you can start improving on that and you can work on it. You've got to remember though, that ultra-processed food is designed to be hyper-palatable and is very tasty, and it's designed such that you don't consume it as much. Consume it an awful lot. So you have to be forgiving to yourself when you do cave in, and you do fall to that addiction. Don't buy it in the first place, there's something else you can try. There are many ways you can slowly build on your skills to break your attachment to this ultra-processed food. And once you do, you will experience the health benefits. But the big one we all need to change is we need to support and encourage the government to make these changes. For a somewhat convoluted explanation, the people who work in the ultra-processed food industry, the people in the factories, they have to be there to earn money for their families. They don't have a choice, they can't make a change. The people the level above them who are selling the products, if they don't sell them, some other company will. The people above them who own the companies, they can't dissolve their company and say, I don't care about, my company, I'm going to get rid of this company for ultra-processed food. They can't do that. Almost all of those companies are heavily involved in shares, and that means businessmen around the world own shares of their company, and which means they get a massive say in their company's decisions. So if a leader or a group of leaders of the company would say, oh, we want to dissolve the company, they wouldn't be able to do that. The chairman would overthrow them, and there are stories of that happening. And that's why it comes down to the government, because the government are the only ones who can implement policies. You may think, well, have they not? And they have tried, but a lot of those policies are financially supported by these ultra-processed food companies. A massive name is Kellogg's. And when Kellogg's try and support these policies, it often doesn't really support our health and the reduction of ultra-processed food. It just leaves the product out on the shelves with a policy that still will benefit and they can avoid. And so the government not only has to make massive policy changes, but they have to keep the companies out of those policy changes, because the companies are biased. Now you understand not only what ultra-processed is, how it's come about, how to get it out of your diet, how it impacts your health, and hopefully, as we come across in the future, information on ultra-processed food, we can encourage the government to make big steps in changing the way the ultra-processed food industry is run and reducing the ultra-processed food we are exposed to. Thank you.